The data card made no sound when it hit the podium. That was the thing nobody in the chamber would forget later. Not the words, not the faces, just the soft, quiet click of a small card placed on a surface, and then 30 years of patience ending. Rena Solis had been standing at that podium for 11 minutes. She had not raised her voice once. She had not used dramatic language. She had read from a prepared document in the same tone a person uses when they are returning something that was never really theirs to begin with. The Galactic Council chamber sat inside Vorath Prime, a ring station so large that its inner curve disappeared into artificial clouds. The chamber itself held 400 seats arranged in a circle, each tier rising above the last like the inside of a shell. The air was kept cold because the Vreth preferred cold. It had always been kept cold. Nobody had ever asked the human delegation whether they minded. Rena minded. She had minded for 6 years. She wore a thermal underlayer beneath her Navy diplomatic uniform and had never once mentioned it. She looked out at the chamber. The Vreth delegation sat at the high tier, as always 7 of them, 4-armed, gray-skinned, robes the color of old stone. Beside them the Delathi reclined in their curved chairs, long pale fingers folded, looking bored. The smaller species, the Areli, the Porathi, the Gethborn, sat in the lower rings, quiet and watchful as they always were when the large species were in the room. Rena finished reading the final line of the document. She placed the data card on the podium and said, "This is our formal notice of withdrawal. Effective in 72 hours, humanity is no longer a member of this council." The chamber was silent for about 4 seconds. Then the Vreth High Speaker, a delegate named Vorath, made a sound that translated loosely as amusement. Several Delathi exchanged glances. From the upper tiers came a low rumble that functioned, in Vreth's social language, as collective laughter. Vorath leaned forward. His translator rendered his words in flat standard galactic. "Delegate Solis, this is not a resignation letter. This is a tantrum." Rena did not blink. "The data card contains the full legal filing," she said. "Our legal team has reviewed it against the founding accords. The withdrawal clause has existed since the Council's formation. No member species has ever used it. We are using it now." "You are a junior species," said a Delathi representative whose name Rena had always found difficult to pronounce. "You have been members for 30 years. You do not have the standing to." "The founding accords do not require standing," Rena said. "They require notice. We have given notice." Another voice from the upper tier. "This is about the Karath Accord. You are upset about mining contracts." "We are not upset," Rena said. "We have not been upset for a long time. That is the point." She picked up her notes. She nodded once to the chamber, not a bow, just an acknowledgement, and walked off the podium. The room erupted behind her. She did not turn around. In the corridor outside the chamber, her aide Dale fell into step beside her. Dale was 26 and had been in diplomatic service for 2 years. His face was doing something complicated. "They are going to send a follow-up request within the hour," he said. "I know. Are we going to respond?" "No." Dale was quiet for a moment. They walked past a row of large viewports. The gas giant outside filled each one in turn, brown and amber bands, slow and enormous, indifferent to the conversation happening in its orbit. "Do you think they believe us?" Dale asked. Rena thought about this. "No, they think we are negotiating. They think this is a pressure tactic. And when they realize it is not." She stopped walking. She looked at the gas giant through the nearest viewport. Something big and patient, she thought. Something that did not need anyone's permission to be what it was. "Then they will understand," she said, "what 30 years of not being taken seriously eventually produces." Back in the chamber, the session had dissolved into argument. 3 competing motions were being filed. The Vreth were calling for an emergency vote to formally reject the withdrawal notice. something that had no legal basis but which several delegates were loudly supporting anyway. The Areli representative, a small feathered figure named Sitha, sat very still in her seat and said nothing. She was watching the door through which Rena had left. Two junior Areli aides leaned close to her and whispered. She waved them off gently. She had met Rena Solis once, years ago, at a trade function on a neutral station. They had talked for 20 minutes about water filtration systems of all things, because both their peoples had water-scarce histories. Sitha had left that conversation thinking, this one is serious. This one means what she says. She thought about that now. The chamber was loud around her. The Vreth were talking about consequences. The Delathi were talking about procedures. Nobody was talking about whether humanity had a reason. Sitha looked at the empty podium where the data card still sat, uncollected. She thought, they are already gone. The rest of this is just the galaxy catching up. Outside, Rena's shuttle disengaged from Vorath Prime and began the long turn toward human space. She did not look back at the station. She had already said everything she came to say. 72 hours. The clock was running. Nobody fired a weapon. Nobody gave a dramatic speech. Nobody blew up a ship or blockaded a lane or sent an ultimatum written in fire. Humanity simply stopped. It happened in stages, and each stage was so quiet that the Council's monitoring networks almost missed it. Almost. The first signal came from Helta 9, a border logistics station that processed roughly 40,000 tons of refined metals per standard cycle. At the start of Cycle 7 on the first day after the withdrawal notice, the outgoing cargo manifests went blank. Every scheduled shipment canceled. Every contract flag withdrawn. The Delathi cargo fleet that arrived 4 hours later found a docking bay so empty that their pilot thought he had the wrong coordinates. A single human technician met them at the bay entrance. His name was Bren. He was 41 years old, had worked logistics for 17 years, and had the kind of face that had long ago stopped being surprised by anything. He handed the Delathi dockmaster a single printed sheet. The dockmaster, whose species communicated partly through skin color shifts, turned a pale and confused green. "This says the contract has been terminated," the translator rendered. "Yes," said Bren. "Under what clause?" Clause 19. Owner's right to withdraw from a non-binding trade agreement with 30 standard hour notice. We gave 72. He pointed to the timestamp at the bottom of the sheet. The dockmaster's skin went through 3 colors in quick succession. The metals were promised. Our fleet needs. "I know," said Bren. "I am sorry for the inconvenience." He was not being sarcastic. He genuinely was sorry. But sorry and willing were two different things, and Bren had been asked to be sorry and willing for a very long time. He went back inside and closed the bay door. On the medical exchange world of Surath, the departure was slower, but no less complete. Human medical teams had been operating there for 19 years. They ran 31% of the world's active care units, not because they were assigned to, but because they had volunteered, and then kept volunteering, and then been expected to keep volunteering until the expectation had quietly become a dependency. The lead physician, a woman named Dr. Yuna, had spent her last week on Surath writing the most detailed handover notes of her career. She documented every patient, every protocol, every supply order, every contact for every vendor. She did this because she was a doctor and because leaving things incomplete was not in her nature, regardless of who had failed to appreciate what she had built. The Areli patients watched the human staff pack. Some of them reached out small feathered hands. One elderly Areli male, who had been receiving treatment for a lung condition for 3 years, held onto Dr. Yuna's wrist for a long moment. His amber eyes were wide and wet. She stayed with him for an extra hour, then she left. The alien medical administrators sent 6 urgent messages to Council headquarters that day. The Council forwarded them to the human diplomatic channel, which was no longer active. In human space, the global assembly was broadcasting on every channel. The session had been running for 9 hours. It was not dramatic. It was careful. Representatives from all 17 colony worlds had floor time and they used it. They talked about the Kareth Accord and the mining rights. They talked about the Surath medical situation and who had been doing that work. They talked about the relay networks and the patrol routes and the border mediation in the Mavathi corridor. They talked about all the things humans had been doing that the galaxy had treated as simply available, like water from a tap, something you assume will always be there when you turn the handle. Outside Earth, Admiral Duro Faz had arranged 12 carrier groups in a wide arc at the edge of human space. They were not advancing. They had been given explicit instructions not to advance. They sat in formation, running lights on, engines idling, and they were simply present, a line made of ships. No council vessel crossed it. The council sent its first diplomatic message at hour 9. It was addressed to the human delegation at Vorath Prime. The human delegation had already departed. The message went to an empty office. The second message, sent at hour 14, was addressed directly to the Global Assembly. It requested an emergency dialogue session within 48 hours. The Assembly noted the request and continued its session. The third message, sent at hour 20, was from Vorath himself. It dropped the formal language. It said, in plain galactic standard, "We believe there has been a misunderstanding. We are willing to discuss your concerns." Rena read it on her shuttle. She set it aside. Not because she was being cruel, but because a message that began with, "We believe there has been a misunderstanding," was not a message that understood what had happened. It was a message that still thought this was a negotiating position. It was a message from people who had not yet accepted that the hand they had spent 30 years reaching for had finally, quietly, completely, pulled back. In a small crew quarters near the back of the shuttle, Dale was writing a letter to his mother on a colony world in the outer ring. He described the chamber, the silence after the data card, the laughter from the Vreth tier. He wrote, "I thought I would feel scared. I do not feel scared. I feel like I have been holding my breath for 2 years and someone finally opened a window." He sent the letter and went to sleep. The shuttle moved through open space. Behind it, somewhere in the dark between stars, the Galactic Council was beginning to understand that the handle was turning and nothing was coming out. The 72 hours were almost done. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when something you never noticed stops working. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a missing sound you did not know you were hearing. The Galactic Council heard that silence on day 6. It started with the relay network. The deep space communication grid that connected the Council's outer colonies to its core worlds was one of the oldest pieces of shared infrastructure in galactic history. It had been built 200 years ago by the Vreth, maintained for a century by a rotating team of species, and then, gradually, without anyone making a formal decision about it, had become the domain of human technicians, not because humans were assigned to it. Because humans had kept showing up. They were reliable in the deep posted stations where other species rotated out after a few months and did not return. Humans stayed. They learned the systems. They taught each other. They wrote the maintenance manuals that everyone else used. On day 5 after the withdrawal, the last human maintenance crew left Relay Hub 7. They locked the systems in stable mode, filed a full technical report with the station's automated log, and boarded their ship. On day 6, Relay Hub 7 needed a calibration update. In stable mode, it could not update itself. It sent an automatic request to its maintenance queue. The maintenance queue was empty. Hub 7 went into error state. 3 connecting nodes, each dependent on Hub 7's signal timing, began drifting out of sync. By the end of day 6, a communications blackout had spread across 42 outer colony systems. The Vreth Outer Fleet lost contact with its command structure for 9 hours. A Delathi passenger liner, rerouting around the blackout, made a navigation error and had to be rescued by a Geth-borne patrol vessel that had only happened to be nearby. Nobody died, but it was close. In the council chamber, Voreth called an emergency session. He stood at the upper tier and demanded that someone explain how a species that had been a member for 30 years had managed to become so deeply embedded in critical systems without any oversight body noticing. Nobody had a good answer, because the answer was uncomfortable. The answer was that oversight bodies notice things that cost money or cause problems. Human technicians working quietly in deep stations did neither. They were simply there doing the work, and the council had filed that under functioning normally and moved on. Meanwhile, on the agricultural moon of Daleth Sev, a food processing crisis was developing. The moon fed a significant portion of the Delathi home system. Its soil was mineral poor and required chemical processing support to grow anything at scale. 19 years ago, human engineers had designed a soil processor network for the moon, a sophisticated system that required a firmware update every 90 days to maintain proper mineral balance. The last update had been 58 days ago. The next one was due in 32 days. The firmware was human-authored and embedded in a proprietary human industrial system. The Delathi engineers who examined it on day 8 reported back to their government with the same expression, though their faces were structured differently from human ones, that anyone wears when they realize the bridge they are standing on was built by someone who is no longer returning their calls. A Delathi government official reached out through back channels to the Human Global Assembly. The message was phrased carefully. It acknowledged that relations had been complicated. It expressed that the Delathi government hoped for a resolution, and it asked, very politely, whether the firmware documentation could be shared. The assembly read it. They met about it. They decided to share the documentation not as a concession, but because letting food production fail on a populated moon was not something any human wanted on their conscience. But they sent it through a new channel, not the council diplomatic channel, a direct Delathi government channel. The message that accompanied the documentation was equally polite, and it included a line that the Delathi government read 3 times. Humanity is happy to assist Delathi directly. Please contact us without routing through the council. It was a small thing. It was also enormous. On the Surin-Mevathi border, the situation was less manageable. For 6 years, a human diplomat named Foss had been making quiet trips between the two sides, drinking whatever they offered him, learning the small gestures that meant discomfort was rising, and intervening before anyone started shooting. He was not famous. He had no title that anyone outside the border zone would recognize. He was simply a human who knew where the pressure points were and kept his hand on them. Foss was on a shuttle back to Earth when the first shots were fired. He heard about it over the ship's news channel. He sat with his hands around a cup of water and stared at the wall for a long time. Then he sent a message to Rena Solis. It said only, "The Mevathi border has opened. You need to know." She responded within the hour. She said, "I know, we are watching." On a small Areli station near the outer rim, Paul, a human engineer on the last day of his contract, watched the same news broadcast. He was supposed to board his ship home in the morning. The Areli station administrator, a thin woman named Tiv with copper-colored feathers and careful eyes, found him in the common room that evening. She sat across from him and said nothing for a while. Then she said, in careful standard galactic, "You are leaving tomorrow." "Yes," said Paul. "Is there anything that would make you stay?" Paul looked at her. He looked at the news screen. He looked at his hands. "That is a very good question," he said. The galaxy was unraveling slowly, the way things do when what held them together was never properly named. The station called the drifting point had no government, no permanent population, and no allegiance to anyone. It existed in the gap between three territorial zones, which meant it belonged to all of them and none of them, which in practice meant it was the one place in the galaxy where anyone could meet anyone without either side having to cross into the other's space. It had hosted peace talks, trade negotiations, a wedding between two species whose home worlds were technically at war, and once, famously, a poker tournament that had nearly started an interstellar incident. It was not a grand place. Its corridors smelled faintly of engine oil and whatever the kitchen had been cooking. Its meeting rooms had mismatched chairs. Rena Solis arrived first. She came with 4 advisors and chose the smallest available meeting room. She did this on purpose. The room had a round table, 8 chairs, walls of brushed metal, and a single viewport that looked out at a quiet stretch of open space. She sat with her back to the viewport so that whoever came in would see the stars behind her. The council delegation arrived 40 minutes later, 12 members from 7 species. They had sent Saru. Rena had not expected that. She had expected Vorath, or a Vreth representative chosen to project authority. Instead, they had sent an elderly Mevathi diplomat, gray-skinned, slow-moving, with eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has watched many things happen and drawn careful conclusions from all of them. Saru had a reputation for saying exactly what he meant, which was unusual in any government and genuinely rare in the council. He sat across from Rena. His delegation filled the remaining seats. Her 4 advisors filled hers. Saru opened a document on the table's display surface and slid it toward her without speaking. She read it. She took her time. 3 pages. Guaranteed seats on the military committee, 4, with full voting rights. Full renegotiation of all resource contracts under independent arbitration. A formal apology for the Karath Accord, worded clearly and without qualifications. Expansion of human colony rights under the settlement framework. And a new clause, one that Rena had not seen proposed before, requiring a unanimous vote, rather than a simple majority, to alter any agreement with a junior species without that species' consent. That last one surprised her. She read it twice. When she looked up, Saru was watching her. "The unanimous clause was your idea?" she asked. "It was mine," he said. "It took 11 hours to get it included. The Vreth abstained from the vote to include it, which is technically not the same as refusing. I consider that progress." Rena almost smiled. She set the document down. She looked at Saru directly. "This is more than I expected." "It is more than the council wanted to offer," Saru said. "But I told them that less would accomplish nothing, and I believe I was right." "You probably were." She folded her hands on the table. "I want to ask you something, not as a formal question, just as one person talking to another." Saru inclined his head. "If we sign this today," Rena said, "and 10 years from now, a new Vreth speaker decides that the unanimous clause is inconvenient, or that the arbitration process takes too long, or that junior species should not have 4 votes on the military committee, what stops that from happening?" Saru was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone searching for an evasion, the quiet of someone being honest about the limits of what they could promise. "Nothing structural," he said finally. "The clause can be challenged. Agreements can be renegotiated. I cannot give you a guarantee that is stronger than the will of the people who would have to honor it." "That is what I thought. But I would say this," Saru continued. "What has happened in the past 18 days has been visible to every species in this council, the small ones, the ones who watch carefully and say little. They have seen what the withdrawal of one cooperative species looks like. They will not forget, and that more than any clause changes what is politically possible." Rena looked at the document again. Outside the viewport, a small freighter drifted past on its way to somewhere. Just a ship, going about its work, indifferent to the conversation happening on the other side of the glass. "I will bring this to the assembly," she said. "I am not signing today. I want that to be clear, not as a power move, but because this decision belongs to more people than me." "Of course," said Saru. "And I want to say something for your record, not just mine." She looked at him steadily. "We did not leave because we wanted to hurt anyone. We left because we had been giving without being seen. That is not sustainable, not for us, not for any species. And if the Council cannot genuinely reckon with that, not as a problem to manage, but as something that was actually wrong, then no document fixes it." The room was very quiet. Saru nodded slowly. "I believe," he said, "that some of us understand that. Whether enough of us do, that is the question I cannot answer today." They shook hands, human style, because Saru had looked it up before the meeting and offered it. His grip was careful and deliberate, like someone doing something they had practiced. The delegation left. Rena stayed in the room alone for a few minutes. One of her advisors opened the door and said her shuttle was ready. She nodded. She picked up the document. She looked at that last clause, unanimous vote, one more time. Then she walked out into the corridor, past the mismatched chairs and the smell of engine oil, and began the trip back to Earth. She had a very long conversation ahead of her. The vote in the Surin Collective to cross the border line had passed by a margin of 3. 3 votes out of 412, and now 3 Surin warships were moving through disputed space, and nobody was picking up the ceasefire channel because the ceasefire channel ran through a relay node that had been in error state for 11 days. The Mavathi scrambled their fleet at 3:40 station time. A duty officer named Rael Young, on her 3rd posting, saw the Surin ships on her scope and made the call to alert her commander without waiting. Her commander looked at the readout and said, "In the Mavathi way. This is the day Foss always said would come if he was not here." They scrambled anyway, because that was the protocol. The first exchange of fire happened at 6:12. Ranging shots mostly. Nobody hit anything. But the intent was now physical and visible and recorded, and once that happens it is very difficult to go backwards without both sides agreeing to do so at the same time, which is the hardest possible moment to ask anyone to agree on anything. Admiral Duro Foz received the alert at 6:21. He was in the middle of a logistics review and set it aside for exactly 4 minutes while he finished the section he was reading, which was his way of making sure he absorbed news before reacting to it. Then he read the full report and called Rena. She was already awake. She had been awake since 4:30, when an early intercept from the border zone had come through. She had been sitting with a cup of water and a list of questions she did not yet have answers to. "We have 2 options," Duro said. "We watch or we move. Tell me what moving looks like." "I send a fast response group, 6 ships, no weapons hot, into the buffer zone between the 2 fleets. We broadcast on all open channels that we are there as a neutral presence. We are not council. We are not allied to either side. We are humans showing up because people are shooting and we would like them to stop." Rena was quiet for a moment. "And if one of the fleets fires at us? Then we have a much larger problem. But I do not think they will. We have no claim on that space. We are not a threat to either side. In my experience, people who are shooting at each other are generally relieved to have a reason to stop." "In your experience?" "In my experience." She thought. She had been thinking since 4:30, and this was the conclusion she had been circling. They had left the council because they were being used. That was true. It was still true. But there was a difference between being used by an institution and stepping back from a conflict where real ships were firing at real people. One was about dignity. The other was about something more basic. "Call the assembly," she said. "We need the vote." The assembly session ran for 4 hours. It was the hardest 4 hours of Rena's diplomatic career, and she had spent 3 of them listening, not talking. The arguments against were honest and serious. "We are not responsible for this. We cannot be the galaxy's emergency service when the galaxy does not respect us. If we go in now, we signal that withdrawing changes nothing, that we will always show up when things get bad, regardless of how we are treated. These arguments had weight. Rena did not dismiss them. Then Avron spoke. He was 32 years old, representing a colony in the Outer Ring. His father had died in a border skirmish 14 years ago, one that the council had declined to classify as a real conflict, which meant no support, no recognition, no memorial. Avron had grown up with that. He had carried it into politics, and it had made him careful and clear in a way that very young representatives sometimes are not. He stood at the podium and said, "I have been listening to both sides of this argument. Both sides are right about something. We should not be the galaxy's servant. That is true. But we also left this council because we believed in something more than just ourselves. We said in the chamber, in public, on every broadcast channel that we were not turning away from the galaxy. We were changing how we engaged with it. If we sit here and watch people die because helping them would be inconvenient, then we did not leave the council because we had principles. We left because we were tired, and tired is not the same as principled." He paused. "We did not leave because we stopped caring. We left because we were being used. Those are not the same thing, and I think we know the difference." The vote passed, not unanimously, but it passed. 6 human ships entered the buffer zone at 1304. They flew under a new flag, not Earth's, not the Council's, but a banner designed 3 weeks ago by a coalition of colony world representatives. A field of dark blue with 17 small white points arranged in the shape of the colony constellation, and Earth at the center. They broadcast on every channel simultaneously. The message was short. It said, "We are here as a neutral presence. We have no territorial claim. We are asking both sides to hold their position for 6 hours while we establish a communication link. We will not stay longer than necessary. We ask nothing in return." The shooting stopped in 40 minutes. It took another 5 hours of relay work, including Paul, who had not gotten on his shuttle home, patching a signal through the Areli station's backup transmitter, to get both fleets on the same channel with working audio. At 1917, the Surin and Mavathi duty commanders agreed to a 72-hour ceasefire. The human ships held position until the agreement was confirmed. Then they turned around and left. They did not stay. They did not claim the zone. They sent one follow-up message to both fleets before departing, and it said only, "When you are ready to talk properly, humanity is available, not as a council function, as a neighbor." Voss, still on his shuttle back to Earth, read the ceasefire report and set his cup down very carefully on the armrest. He looked out the small porthole at open space for a long time. Then he opened a message to Rena and typed, "Tell me where you need me next." 40 days after Rena placed a data card on a podium and walked away, the galaxy was quieter than it had been in years. Not peaceful, it was not that simple, but quieter. Like a room after a long argument when everyone has finally said the thing they had been afraid to say and the air has changed. Paul stayed. He had not made a speech about it. He had not written a letter to the assembly or filed any official paperwork. He had simply not gotten on his shuttle. He had gone back to the maintenance bay, picked up his tools, and started a diagnostic on the station's secondary water reclamation unit, which had been showing intermittent pressure readings for 3 weeks, and nobody had found time to look at it. Tiv, the station administrator, found him there 2 hours after his shuttle had departed. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Your ship left." "I know," said Paul. "You missed it deliberately." The reclamation unit was losing pressure. If it failed during the next supply delay, it would have been a significant problem for the eastern residential section. Tiv was quiet for a moment. Her copper feathers moved slightly, the Areli equivalent of a slow exhale. "We would like to offer you a contract," she said. "Direct, not through the council, our terms, your terms. We negotiate until we agree." Paul looked up from the unit. What are the terms you are starting with? Fair pay, your own quarters, and the understanding that you are here because you want to be, not because anyone assumed you would stay. Paul thought about this. He thought about the 30 years of humans being assumed. He thought about Helta 9 and Surath and the relay network, and all the invisible work that had held things together without anyone calling it by name. That last part, he said, put that in writing. Already drafted, said Tiv. The Aureli signed with humanity 2 weeks later. It was not a grand treaty. It was a bilateral services agreement, practical, specific, reviewed annually, with exit clauses for both sides. But it was the first agreement of its kind, negotiated between humanity and another species entirely outside the Council framework. The Porathi followed 11 days after that. Then a small confederacy of outer rim stations that had never had enough political weight to negotiate with the Council at all. They reached out to the Human Assembly directly, and the Assembly sent a team, and that team spent 3 weeks on a station that smelled like recycled air and machine grease, eating whatever the local population offered, and learning the specific problems that needed solving and writing contracts that addressed those specific problems rather than the general ones. In the Galactic Council, something was shifting, not collapsing. The Council was too old and too large to collapse quickly, but the Vreth were quieter. Voreth had given 2 public addresses in the past 40 days, and both of them had been notably careful, which was new. The reform proposals that Saru had been moving through committee had gained votes from species that had never voted for reform before. The Aureli representative Sitha, who had sat silent in the chamber on the day of the withdrawal, had given a speech that was now being quoted across 17 news networks in 3 languages, though she had never raised her voice above a conversational tone. She had said, "We built a council on the assumption that some voices were naturally louder than others. We have spent 40 days learning the cost of that assumption. The question now is whether we have learned enough." The Global Assembly received the Council's revised offer, the same document Rena had brought back from the drifting point, with 3 additional clauses added after the border ceasefire. The Assembly debated it for 6 days. They did not accept it. They did not reject it. They sent back a counter-proposal of their own. Humanity would re-engage with the Council on specific issues, border conflicts, medical exchange, relay network maintenance, through new joint working groups that reported to both bodies equally, not through the Council hierarchy. They would not rejoin as a member. They would participate as a partner on defined terms that could be expanded if the partnership worked. The Council took 9 days to respond. The response was yes. It was not a perfect solution. Nothing about it was perfect. There were species in the Council who were furious. There were humans who thought the counter-proposal went too far. Rena had not slept more than 5 hours in any night for the past 3 weeks, and she had developed a habit of sitting in front of the assembly building in the early hours before anyone else arrived, looking at the sky. Dale found her there one morning, 20 minutes before the day's session. He brought 2 cups of water and sat beside her without asking. She looked at the sky. It was early enough that the first light was still soft, a few stars still visible. "Do you think it will hold?" Dale asked. "I think it will hold as long as enough people want it to," Rena said, "which is true of every agreement that has ever existed." "That is not very reassuring." "No," she agreed, "but it is honest." On the Aureli station, Paul had finished the water reclamation unit and moved on to recalibrating the navigation array, which had a misalignment that the automated systems had been compensating for so long that nobody had noticed it was wrong. He worked in the mornings and ate with whoever was in the common room at mealtimes, and was slowly learning 12 words of the Aureli language, which had 4 tones and no word for the concept of being alone as a negative thing. He found that interesting. The Aureli child who had tugged at his sleeve, her name was Irv, had started following him on his maintenance rounds. She did not help. She was 6 and not permitted near active equipment. She simply walked behind him and watched. Sometimes she asked questions. Most of the questions were about why things worked the way they did, and Paul answered all of them, even the ones that required 15 minutes to explain properly. Her parents had thanked him once, a little awkwardly, in the way of people who were not sure whether thanks was appropriate or expected. He had told them it was no trouble, and he meant it. Not in the way of someone performing niceness. In the way of someone who had found, without exactly looking for it, the thing they had actually come out here to do. On Earth, a child asked her father what humanity was now, if not part of the council. He thought about it for a long moment. He looked at the stars coming out. Free, he said, and still here. She thought about this seriously, the way children do. Is that good? She asked. He put his arm around her. Outside, the sky was going from blue to the dark at the edge of space, and somewhere out there the relay networks were running, and ships were moving, and people of many kinds were doing the work of being alive in the same galaxy. Yeah, he said, I think it is.